Welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Jean Bernard Cremnitzer. I'm architect in Paris, and I'm also professor at the Normandie School of Architecture. As an architect, I have been involved in many projects to rehabilitate worker houses in different cities of France, and especially in Normandy. So this is the reason why I am here today. I will be starting by looking at the history context in France, and then I will explain the creation of the cheap housing system, which began in 1894. And finally, I will show some challenges and answers to the specific question of rehabilitation. The question for me is, what is the future for all the workers' villages? Well, I have been studying architecture at the School of Paris Belleville, where the specialist of worker housing, Roger-Henri Guéron, like Gracia has spoken about, taught this subject. At that time, in the 70s, this topic was totally new and innovative in France. This professor had a very strong personality, which also made this topic fascinating. His book, History of Social Housing, was published in 1966. It was the first book which treated this question. This specific course has influenced a part of my activity for the last 40 years. So this is the reason why I have been working on the rehabilitation of this architecture. As you know, the question about workers' housing is directly connected to the Industrial Revolution. The big industrialization in France began in the 1850s and produced a huge migration from the countryside to big cities and new industrial areas, especially along the rivers, and also to coal and iron extraction centers. As a result, there was a big increase of substandard housing, especially in Paris, Marseille, Lille, and Le Havre. Poor sanitary conditions caused a lot of epidemics. Cholera, and especially tuberculosis, with about 150,000 deaths every year. To fight against epidemics, which had great negative impact on the productivity, and also to fight against social riots, the industry companies and politics had to find a way to build new types of housing with better sanitary conditions. The first option was to build collective barrackments copied from the military barracks. As you can see on this slide, this is a caserne des douanes in Le Havre, 1850. But the big concentration of workers in the same establishment was soon considered as a threat and a risk of political activities inside the barrackments. So the building with private investment became the most usual way to produce housing for workers. The political leaders found that the best solution was individual or semi-detached houses. But the land costs in big cities decide that collective house with 3, 4, 5, or 6 levels were more profitable. So we may say that most of the workers in France have lived in private properties from 1850 to 1930. Company towns were another option. They were established outside the big cities in the new industrial territories hosting coal, iron, or textile industries. These houses had higher standards than slums in big cities. The workers didn't pay any rent, and the gardens attached to the houses gave them the possibility of producing their own vegetables. But this production issued from company towns was peanuts compared to the housing needs in France. The French government also tried to develop a better housing standard with architect competitions and experimental buildings. The Emperor Napoleon III was very active, building different types of housing in Paris, like the Cité Napoléon Boulevard Rochechouart, and prototypes of social housing at the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1867. Some few industry entrepreneurs were also very active, like Jean-Baptiste Gaudin, who built a whole city in Guise, in the east of France, not only with dwellings, but also with schools, public baths, theater, inspired by the phalanstère of a French utopist philosopher, Charles Fourier. But the real innovation in the French housing politics was the creation of a system based on public investment and mortgage, which later will be called the French social housing. This picture shows one of the first cheap housing called HBM, Habitation à Bon Marché, built in Paris in 1902, Rue de Belleville in Paris, by the Rothschild Foundation. The flats were designed by architects with a higher standard, with livable surfaces, and a setting issued from the new hygiene dogmas, inspired by the sanatoriums, light, air, and sun. The deputy Jules Siegfried was the creator of this new type of housing. As a member of parliament, he drafted a legislation in 1894 which gave the opportunity for private investors and company owners to get a loan by the National Bank Caisse des Dépôts to invest in social housing. In 1912, the Bonnevet legislation was voted by the Parliament, which decided that public collectivities and real estate promoters issued from these collectivities get also the opportunity to invest in social housing. This legislation allowed the creation of a national net of public investors and the construction of 100,000 HBM housing, cheap housing. For this last century, this system has been the official way to produce social housing. It took many years for this system to be on the rise and to offer a massive production. Two different types of HBM were built. In the big cities, it was mostly collective housing, as you can see in this early production built in Le Havre in 1912 on the right, or later in the 20s, whole districts inspired by the English garden cities like the Butte Rouge district in Châtenay-Malabry on the left, or Suresnes in the Paris suburb. In small cities, the low cost of the land gave the opportunity to build houses, individual or semi-detached, with different styles of architecture. The most dominant style was what we call neo-regionalist, inspired from the traditional architecture in the countryside and also from England, as you can see here in Normandy, with pastiche of timbered houses. But some experimentation gave a contribution to the modern architecture movement, like the Cité Frugès in Pessac, near Bordeaux, which was designed by Le Corbusier in 1927 with a completely new vocabulary. Well, this is a short summary of the positive and negative aspects of HBM garden cities today. Well, first, the positive aspect on the left. This type of architecture has a high significance and a real heritage value. It's most of the time individual housing, so people have a private garden with vegetation. They have also a possibility of parking on the plots. The rents are usually low, as it is still most of the time social housing. And there is also a real social life in these districts. But there are also some negative aspects. The sanitary and technical standards are very low. There is no thermic insulation. The dwellings are small, unadapted to old people, and they are most of the time far from the town centers with bad communications. In my practice as an architect, I have been confronted to different challenges regarding the upgrading of worker housing. First, the urban integration of a workers' district in the city. Secondly, the functional quality, how to have today a comfortable flat adapt to the new generations. Third, the social and symbolic aspects, how to mix different types of populations, how to give a better status to these houses. Fourth, the heritage question, how to protect and restore these houses which belong to the working memory heritage. And fifth, the economic question, what is the cost of restoration compared to new production? So I will now illustrate these challenges with some concrete examples. This district, called Le Trait, is located on the Seine bank. It was originally a company town built in the 20s for a shipyard called Worms Industry. About 600 houses, mostly for workers, were designed by architects using the public loans for HBM and built by the company and the HBM office of the Seine-Maritime County. The roads were the only exterior public spaces. The company owned the school, the church, the health center, and all the houses. Nowadays, the houses have been sold to the inhabitants, the company has disappeared, and the town doesn't have any public spaces except the streets. So, the people have no place where they can meet each other or have citizenship interactions opposite to a traditional town. This other district is situated in the suburb of Caen, a big town in Normandy on the coast, and called Saint-Jean-Eudes. It was the first example of garden cities in Normandy built by the new HBM public office of Calvados County for the steel industry workers. The big expansion of the city in these last years has caused a huge increase of the land prices. As a result, this district, which has a very low density, undergoes a process of demolition and construction of collective and dense buildings. However, as a part of the district is protected by the Culture Ministry, we could find a compromise after having studied different solutions by restoring the houses which have the highest architectural value. You can see here the two solutions with, in red, the new buildings which can be built, and in gray, the existing buildings. This new example is also a garden city and is situated in Deauville, the famous touristic town in Normandy. This small district was also built by the same HBM public office of Calvados County. The area, which has about 40 houses, is an outlying district trapped between the railway and the hippodrome and is far from the city center. The recent urban project, adapted by the municipality, is to create a bicycle and pedestrian path to connect this district to the town center. The project is also to give a better environment to the main street with plantation of trees and secured pavements. The houses will be also restored with better standard conditions. Yeah, so another question is the functional dimension. So how to adapt the existing housing to the new populations. Most of the people living in this type of HBM garden cities are old, and the households with steep staircase are not fit for handicapped people. The rooms are very small, about 12 square meters for a living room, and the bathrooms are most often not suited for old people. As there is a lack of space, the inhabitants have built themselves different sheds in extension of their houses, which have a bad constructive quality and premature degradations due to humidity. You can see here in blue the new extensions built by the inhabitants. So these constructions have been built without permit and are illegal. They also have a negative impact on the urban landscape and the status of a district. So the projects I'm now working on consist in upgrading the housing for new populations, especially for young families with children, and also to adapt the houses for old people with only one level and comfortable bathrooms. As the existing surfaces are small, the project is to twin the houses together. Here you can see an example of upgrading for a family with children. Two houses, two flats are twinned together, which gives better comfort, bigger surfaces, with large bathrooms and kitchen. The houses adapt also for handicapped people. Sorry, yes, this is one. And in this case also, the twin process gives the possibility to have one family house with two levels. Yes, that's what I say. And a flat adapt for handicapped. Excuse me. Yes, another question is the social and symbolic cohesion. The most difficult aspect for an architect is to have some power decision about the social aspects, as the public client has all power to decide what kind of people will live in the housing. Another aspect is the symbolic dimension. These houses were designed as a cheap and minimal pastiche of a rich resort cottages built for the bourgeois on the Normandy coast. The well-designed facades and roofs of these worker houses are hiding minimal and low standard inside. So the twin process gives the opportunity for a family to live in a whole house and not in a half house. Maybe it can give them a better social status. Another question is the social memory, as we have very few archives about this question, about these villages. It's very difficult to remind this immaterial memory. So the only way we have is to interview the old inhabitants who are still in life. So the heritage question is very important also. You can see on these pictures some very significant architectural details, like the roof, the chimneys, the details of timbered facades. The French legislation gives different opportunities to protect the heritage buildings. For example, all the constructions which are situated less than 500 meters from a listed monument are protected and can be destroyed without the decision of a culture ministry architect. And for special areas called AVAP, which have a specific architectural quality, all the buildings are protected. Only the local culture administration can decide on the degree of protection and how a house should be restored. So, if a worker house is belonging to one of these options, the protection is rather easy. For the project I'm working now in Caen, we design the restoration regulations which will be used for the rehabilitation process. And it was most for the facades, the windows, the roof, and the chimneys. We have no specification for inside of the buildings. These specifications have been written jointly with the architects of the Ministry of Culture. The goal is to restore the original parts of the facades and the roofs. For example, all the plastic windows are forbidden, and the same thing with the roof. The concrete tiles are also forbidden for the restoration. And this work means also that we need a research in the archives and find the original drawings and the blueprints to find the original state of these buildings. And finally, the last question is the economic dimension. A lot of contracting authorities don't have any sensibility for the heritage, and they think that it's more easy and cheap to destroy these low standard houses and build new generic housing. Regarding the garden city in Caen, I mentioned before, I made a comparison chart of the cost between new construction and upgrading. The brutto cost, as ballpark prices, they look similar between new construction and rehabilitation. It's about 1,200, 400 euro for square meters. But there are also other criteria which are interesting, like grey energy consumption. It's very, much more interesting to restore the buildings because the grey energy costs are very low. The architecture is higher also when you restore the house because the new, as you can see, the new generic production for social housing has no real architectural quality. And another question is also the flood ability. Very often these districts are situated in flood ability district, and it's very difficult to build new houses because you have to have higher buildings, and when you have existing buildings, you are allowed to restore the house without new legislation. But the real problem for this district is the low density of existing houses, especially when the urban regulations give the opportunity to have a higher density of construction. So I will now conclude. So I would like just to say that the architectural practice is not only a question of technical expertise. The architect is like a go-between, transferring the memory of a historical heritage to the future generations. He has a social and political responsibility to save and adapt the existing buildings by transforming their ordinary quality to remarkable architectures. He must not only be a clever technician, but also an activist of the restoration of heritage houses. Thank you very much.